Hello everyone. Today is another live stream from our remote location, so you can see our living rooms and our ginormous coffee mugs, apparently. Gee, Jeremy, you need two hands to hold this. I guess that's what crypto does to people. So you want to walk us through it, what you're looking at?
Sure. Oh, good. The button's not right this time. Okay, so this feature is for making reader and writer components for what's technically ASN1 BER, SIR, and DIR data, but colloquially is just referred to ASN data. So ASN.1 is a modeling language similar to UML, in that it generally describes the shape that data is going to take. It also has a value semantic, so you can express actual values, but most people don't really use that. These data formats, DIR is used for X509 certificates, and BER is used for some other components of cryptography, such as the cryptographic message syntax formats. LDAP uses either BER or DIR, I don't remember which. SIR and DIR are both different forks of restrictions upon BER. They actually have expanded names, which are basic encoding rules, canonical encoding rules, and the distinguished encoding rules. They are 3 of the 11, I think, current different ways of writing down data that was modeled under ASN.1. These reader and writer here, we've needed internally since we went cross-platform, because while Windows has crypt encode object and crypt decode object that did most of this work for us, it's not always the same on all the platforms, and we started needing a standardized way of doing it. It also turns out that there are a lot of cases that user code needs to do this as well. In particular, in the case of certificate extensions that we don't have platform support for, since this is the structure that the data is encoded in, it's hard to read it unless you have a structured reader. And the spec is, I think, 700 pages. So that's the intro.
All right, so then do we just look at the APIs, or how do you want to? Well, you can probably look at the scenarios first, because it might actually help.
Right. So under scenarios, I have a couple examples of using the API. So right now in .NET, we don't offer a rich object for the authority key identifier extension for certificates. And so then the first thing I have here is this is the actual ASN1 definition. So it says an authority key identifier is a sequence, which effectively means class or struct. This sequence has 3 different optional components. One's a key identifier, which was later defined to be an octet string. One is a structure called general names, and one is a structure called certificate serial number. So this shows that the language supports optional things. The numbers in square braces indicate that these use explicit, or well, it says implicit at the top. So they use an implicit override of their default encoding identifiers. I guess all of this data is a tag length and value triplet. So what kind of data are you seeing? How long is the data? And then what's the payload? So then we just have a example of writing something that uses the first choice, which is we new up a writer push sequence. Since it's a composite model, what I've gone for with the writer is you always tell it when you want to start doing a composition, and then you do all the individual fields, and then you end it, and then it goes back and calculates what the length needed to have been for you, because it's not always very obvious. So you push a sequence, write the octet string, pop the sequence, and then turn that into the X509 extension object in Bob's your uncle. Okay.
Okay.
So are you saying that the users won't be able to set the length themselves?
At no point with the writer do you ever indicate what the length is going to be. Okay, it calculates it based on the payload.
We'll talk about the reader in a bit.
Yeah, we'll get there. All right, the other examples probably aren't worth going over given time constraints, but they're there, so we can go ahead and jump down to goals.
And so to be clear, like what we are parsing here is the data that is encoded in that format, not the format description itself.
Correct. So what we're actually reading is data encoded according to ITU TREC 690, which is the rules for BER, SIR, and DIR encoded data for data using the ASN1 language.
Yeah, I knew that.
Right. So, I mean, a little bit of that pedantism is actually slightly relevant because while I've used the name ASN everywhere in the classes or in the types, we're not actually processing ASN. We're processing BER, SIR, and DIR. The trouble is the family of encodings that includes BER, SIR, and DIR is called BER, and it felt awkward to have a BER reader that you have in DIR mode, but an ASN reader in BER mode makes more sense, at least to me. So we can talk about that later. All right, so the goals are to have a stateful reader as a reference type so that it's easy to use correctly, which can read the X690 BER data and allow callers to indicate that they are only willing to accept the more stringent SIR or DIR modes when they're doing the reader. We also want a stateful writer so that someone can write these things, and the model that I've opted for is linear writing patterns, so we're not doing particles or precomposed objects. It's you declare, I want to write this next value, and so on. And the writer always will apply the conformance for you that you need for the standards or that you've chosen, and it will always compute the links for you. You never provide them. The next goal I've actually been overly specific in. I said to provide a ref-struct version of the reader for performance-critical scenarios. As we get there, one thing that I have been thinking is instead of having it as a ref-struct reader, it's just the utility methods and the caller does the slicing on their own, because that's the only value that it has from being the ref struct is it can slice for you. And then the reader and writer are going to use .NET paradigms for things. Usually these things align, and but in the cases that they don't, it's going to be .NET-isms, not BER-isms. And anything that we don't have support for, it should always be possible for the caller to implement themselves on top of this.
Right. So one question, like, why only a ref-struct reader? Why no ref-struct writer?
Because it needs to grow in the middle, and that's dangerous. See also the JSON writer experience.
Sure, but like, does it mean that we only have critical scenarios for reading, or do we have any for writing?
We have them for writing, just like we did do for JSON, but the complexity of using the ref-struct writer correctly exceeds its value.
Oh, I see what you're saying. So you have an optimized writer. It's just that it's not a ref-struct. It's an actual
It's a class.
I see.
So non-goals. This is not a serializer or deserializer. This is just a reader and a writer. Serializers are really hard. It does not compile the ASN1 language into .NET types. That's left as an exercise to the reader, and perhaps it'll be a source gen thing, probably not in V5.
Right.
And then there are a number of types that we don't support. I have a partial list here. It might be complete. And then the rest of the encoding family, or the encoding families, such as the XML encoding structure, the JSON encoding structure, the packed and unaligned packed, and yeah, there are many different encodings for this data. This is only doing the Burr family.
So Kevin is asking, what is an example of they do not align? I assume that refers to the goal, the reader and writer use C# .NET paradigms and translate to BR paradigms when they do not align.
Right. So the one place that I can think of off the top of my head where the paradigms don't align is there's an ASN1 type called a named bit list, which is equivalent to a flag enum in .NET, but their bit lists do bit major byte minor order, meaning if you were to look at a memory dump, the leftmost bit in the dump is bit 0. And most people, when writing enums in .NET, start with 1 is the first value. And especially once it's written down as a variable length encoding, it's hard to map the structure correctly. So I've opted for the reader and writer. They will support the flags enums using .NET easy-to-use semantics, and they'll do the twist internally.
Makes sense.
Okay.
All right. Then I think we can jump to the APIs if you want to look at any APIs there.
Yep. So that should just be at the next section we start hitting API. This will be our famous emo scroll.
My machine is struggling with Teams and streaming at the same time, apparently. All right.
Okay, so just off the top of what got shared, I have a note that this class tries to use consistent, or these verbs consistently. Once we get to the reader, the word peek means it will tell you what the data is, but will not advance the reader. Read means it will return the value and advance the reader. And copy is for when some types of data are allowed to span multiple segments, more like read-only sequence than read-only span, and this is draining that out into a single buffer for you. All copies could be called reads if we choose when we get there, but definitely it tries to maintain a distinction between peek and read, and so nothing is get, because get was ambiguous with the state. Okay.
Yeah.
So the first thing inside any data stream that you're reading Burr data is the actually ASN1 tag. So tags have one of 4 classes. It's just a 2-bit field. They have a state called primitive or constructed. Primitive means they contain the value, and constructed means they contain other ASN encoded data. Every tag has a numeric value, and then there's one of the classes is called universal, and so it'll say things like universal 2 means integer, and so that is just defined in the spec that universal class tag 2 means it's an integer, and we'll get to what that means later. So in the constructors for this struct, there's an accelerator for you're building something from a universal tag number, so you can say new ASN1 tag of universal tag number integer, and it will build you the tag representation of that. Otherwise, it just has a couple of constructors. So most tags support both, or at least many tags support both a primitive and a constructed form. The equals method on this, when we get there, is strict equality. So it's going to just look at your encoding and see if they're identical. So the AsConstructed method will give you a tag with the same class and value, but with the constructed bit set, whether or not it was on the input. Similarly, AsPrimitive will clear the constructed bit, and then this lets you do equals equals against a normalized encoding if you want to.
I see. So that makes sense to me. So how many fields do you actually have in that thing? Like you're holding up probably to the tag class, the tag value, and the is constructed, I suppose, right?
It's a byte and an int.
Okay, so that's pretty good. Yeah.
The bit is the constructed bit is smuggled along with the class.
Right. So
okay, so this is a data form, so it has a static try code. Excuse me. The only semantic for the try is it detected that it was a multiple byte encoding, but it ran out of bytes before it ran out of tag. It'll return false if it's just gibberish. Sorry, it'll return false if it's too short, and it'll throw if it's massive gibberish, but that's actually really hard at this point. Each tag will tell you how many bytes it will be in the encoding. A flaw of many readers that I've seen are they assume these tags are only 1 byte, but they're not. The spec has no upper bound on the tag length. We have a 2 to the 32 limit because that's what I wrote. And then similarly, it can be encoded. It can be compared for equality. And then because the comparison of the equality method is strict, but generally you don't want strict, I have a method called has same class and value, which is a named weak equality method.
basically it skips the is constructed.
It skips, yeah, it would be the same as if you called, tag dot as constructed equal current tag.
I see.
So it avoids you needing to normalize both sides if all that you cared about are the tag and the class and the value the same.
So one question I have is it's more like a question for both you and Levi is decode the right verb here, or should we just call this read and write?
I was matching. I forget what else we did. When we did the cryptographic timestamps, encode and decode are the verbs that Christoph suggested.
Okay.
Yeah, I think encode and decode are okay. My gripe, honestly, is with has same class and value, just because I want it to be static instead of instance, but whatever. Because you're basically comparing two things for equivalence, not equality, and since left and right can be swapped, that seems to me to be a good candidate for a static method, but me.
Yeah.
I don't feel that strongly about it.
I mean, that's my other kind of, I wouldn't say issue, but I mean, that's the general consistency problem we have in the BCR, right? That we don't really have symmetry between these different kind of operations. I mean, I don't feel strongly either. I think encode as an instant method makes sense as well. Just feels slightly odd.
Well, encode as an instance is common. We have that in a lot of places, at least in the crypto spaces. But yeah, I mean, has same class and value could be static instead of, or it can be static taking 2 tags instead of instance. That's fine. I think it makes the call sites a little longer, but I don't care.
All right.
Well, if we could shorten the method name in order to make the call sites smaller. We could call it, our is equivalent instead of is equals, but equivalence is kind of a concept we're making up at this point.
Indeed.
Well, it's not that equals is well defined either, right? Like it's whatever you want it to be.
Right. And then for common data types, so Boolean, integer, null, etc. I have just accelerator properties. Actually, accelerator static read-onlys. And which we can change to properties.
I was going to say, like, how do we feel about that? Because, I mean, we have done both. I think the only reason why we do fields very often is because they perform better than properties, right? Because of the nested access usually.
Right. Well, I think recently we've taken the trend that says that the accelerators should be properties so they could be lazy initialized, but since this is a value type instead of a reference type, it doesn't matter as much.
Yeah. I think for the problem was generally taken with structs is when you have them as properties, then the compiler is forced to make copies. But I guess in your case, because you marked it as read only, the compiler shouldn't do that anyways.
Right. The compiler will optimize this whole thing away if you wanted to.
Right. So I think the static read-only field makes more sense here because it'll just be a memory address instead of a value copy on the property get.
Yeah.
Okay.
Seems fine. Tag class.
Tag class. There are 4 classes. They're called universal, application, context, specific, and private. Those are the words in the spec.
Cool. Let's scroll past that. And I guess, so one question I have is, I guess the values also from the spec, right? You didn't make them up, I suppose.
Right. So these, so the 2-bit, or in the Burr family of encodings, the first byte, the top 2 bits tell you what the class is. And for performance reasons of just masking it over top that bit, or that byte, I've used the values from the spec, and most people shouldn't care because it's just going to do equality.
Right. The one question we have from Kevin is, end of contents seems interesting to have as an as-in-one tag. What is that?
End of contents is the special marker used for indefinite encoding that says you've reached the end of an indefinite encoding. So for a sequence of, which is like a list, it's the marker. If the beginning of the list said, I don't know how long I am, it tells you stop reading, you've hit the end of this list. So it is universal class 0 tag 0, which is encoded as a tag, but is technically not one if you read the spec. But it's a common enough comparison if you're reading the data raw. But we could eliminate the accelerator because most people don't need it.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like an export API more or less anyway, so I don't think hiding it will add much.
Jeremy, I had a quick question on tag class. You said per the specification, the tag class is represented as 2 bits, correct? Not as an octet?
Correct.
So because we're already using a different data type because we don't have a 2-bit data type, does it make sense for us to have tag class as an int just because that's a default for enums? Now, I know that normally we've said that if the specification says that some enum has a very particular width, we should use that as the backing type, but we're not using a 2-bit width here.
Yeah, it could just be int backed.
I mean, I don't really care all that much. It's just I know it's what we've done for consistency with our other data types.
Yep. Yeah. It means it'll use an I4 operation for doing the comparison, but it should be fine.
Which is already faster than using bytes anyway.
All right.
Like, using ints is almost always faster than using bytes in .NET.
Fair enough. All right. Are you taking the notes, Emo, or do I need to catch
Sorry,
up?
I was just taking other notes. So what was the suggestion?
Tag class, currently I have extending byte. It should just be a normal enum and extend it.
Should extend int, is that what you say?
Yeah.
Works for me. So what is the reason for that? I mean, we do have byte-based enums in the framework, right?
We do, but generally, whenever we have an enum backed by anything other than an int, it's because the protocol very specifically specifies that width for something. For instance, say that we're passing something to a Windows API that takes a uShort as a parameter, like our enum would be backed by short or uShort at that point. But in this case, the specification doesn't say that the tag class is an 8-bit integer. It says it's a 2-bit integer. Since we don't have such a data type in .NET, may as well just use it, since we have to do our checks anyway.
Fair enough.
Well, it's actually a 2-bit mask in a 8-bit field, but yeah.
So does that mean that in the constructor you're already checking that tag class is one of these 4 very specific values?
Yes.
Okay, so, I mean, that check would be faster if it were an int anyway.
Yeah. All right, universal tag number. I guess that's just the thing that it is.
Right, so these are, in the spec, it'll just say something like open square brace, universal. In the spec, classes are always written in all caps. Space 1, close square bracket, and it will say that is Boolean. And so the spec doesn't have the phrase universal tag number, but it's what it is. So I think. Go ahead.
Sorry, like it sounds like it looks like from the names it's similar to the accelerators, but I guess it's not, right?
The accelerators for the simple values. So I mentioned the primitive and constructed encodings. Boolean, integer, and null always have to have a primitive encoding. So there's an accelerator that just says this is a Boolean tag because primitive is the only sensible value for it. But the bit string and octet string values have both primitive and constructed, so they each have 2 accelerators, one for their constructed format and one for their primitive format. So it's a very similar list, but it's different.
Yeah, also, this says way more entries, so it's, I guess, not everything makes sense as an accelerator. Is that?
Well, some of these values have 2 accelerators, and some of these values aren't represented.
I see. All right.
So, like, we don't do anything with the object descriptor type, so we don't have an accelerator for it because that's what I decided for whether or not you needed an accelerator, is whether or not I needed it anywhere in the crypto stack.
It's not that Jeremy is opinionated or anything.
It's usage. It's data driven.
I trust Jeremy's opinions more than like anyone else on this.
So
I want to look at that.
This probably won't just be used for crypto. We've got the LDAP work coming up. So you might want to talk to the devs that are doing that to see if you've missed anything that they need.
Yeah, I mean, like anything like an accelerator that is common in LDAP that we don't have, we can certainly add. And I know one thing that this current proposal doesn't support that LDAP wants, and I'm thinking of how we can solve that problem.
Okay.
All right, so the only weird things in here are the ASN1 language has a concept called instance of, which it then says encodes the same as the thing called external. So I've defined both of them in the universal tag number as aliases. And now we can talk about the casing of UTF-8 string.
Oh, God. There is no correct casing. I mean, we use them all, right? We use UTF-8. So
in this case, I matched the casing from the spec.
That seems okay.
Is bizarrely one of the few things they didn't write in all caps, but the UT and F and the S are all caps, and then the rest of string is as written. But I don't care about the casing. I'll accept whatever we feel the correct answer is in 2020.
I mean, if this is what the spec said for that, I would just go with that. It seems okay to me, at least, to have inconsistency within our own naming, as long as we're generally consistent within a particular specification.
yeah, I mean, like, I don't think it's the end of the world. I mean, like, you're not using both at the same time, probably, anyways, so that's going to be fine.
Not currently. I mean, when UTF-8 string becomes real as a type, then presumably we'll have a read UTF-8 string, and then the type that you give it when we get there is UTF-8 cased a different way. So,
Right.
all right. So then we get a bunch more string types they've defined in the spec. Again, they have an alias that T61 and teletext are the same thing. IA5, aka ASCII. ISO 64 is visible because reasons. More casing for BMP string, which is UCS2. No surrogates.
Yeah, I'm not a fan of the casing,
Yeah.
but that's the best for crypto for you, so I think I'd bring up on that.
Okay. Now, speaking of casing and identifiers, right. So the reader and the writer both support being in one of three modes. Burr is lax reading, and the writer will usually write in the dir form if you tell it to write in Burr mode, because it's what most readers are going to, most readers are going to expect. And then the SIR modes and dir modes. I know our general rule is that we would expand acronyms here, but I think this hits one of the cases where most people who are familiar with the tech know what the acronyms are, but they don't actually know what they expand to. So it's like HTML. Yes, you use it, and you know what it means, but you don't know what it expands to. So we can alias it, or I just propose doing just the acronyms.
No, keep it short. I like this.
I mean, even if you spell it out, I don't think that this API gets any easier to use, so I don't think that makes a difference.
All right. So that's all of those are all of the types that are common to both the reader and the writer.
All right, so now you want to start with the writer, I see. Okay.
Yeah. Excuse me. All right. So writer, you give it a rule set.
Hold on, why is it disposable?
So the current implementation of the writer is that as it grows, it will use the shared array pool. So now we can have the great discussions of should the constructor accept an array pool argument, should the constructor accept a size hint for how big it should be in the first place, or do we just dump the pooling and make it non-disposable?
I would probably just keep it simple, drop the dispose right now, and then figure out if we need to add it later for performance.
You don't want to add a non-disposable in V2, though.
No, not in V2, but in like a future preview before this thing actually ships to real.
Yeah, okay, I mean, like we use this a lot inside, inside our current implementations of like certificates and stuff. And the writer, I mean, we do always have it in a using. So all of our internal methods are amortized 0, but I guess they're amortized 1 because it's a class, but. But I don't know for public if that complexity is worth it. I know with JSON document we decided it was worth it because the purpose of it was to get as close to 0 as it could. I don't know if it's important enough here. Like this really shouldn't be on anyone's hot path.
Yeah, well, the other thing that we now need to keep in mind is like if we are using a shared array pool under the covers, have we guarded against multi-threaded access not corrupting the state of the shared array pool, blah, 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 which is just... because one of the guarantees that we do make is even if a type is not listed as thread safe, we still guarantee that non-thread safe access to such a type will not corrupt the global state of the application.
Right.
While you're bringing up hot paths, I'm going to drop back to LDAP again, because the LDAP stuff will be the basis of RBAC inside Kerberos containers. So people generally want that sort of thing to be reasonably quick.
Right. I mean, but they could use their own excuse me, object pooling, so they get to share peak growth size as an amortized cost within their application, or use thread statics or.
Yeah. Okay, that's fair enough.
But yeah, so I think if we're going to drop the pooling, we probably want to overload the constructor, then to accept a size hint for what the first array size should be.
Okay, so that seems a bit odd, but I guess you can do that. Yeah.
No, it's like list with its initial capacity.
Yeah, list, memory string, string builder. Like we have this pattern elsewhere.
Yeah, I guess it depends on what your mental model of the writer is. Like if you think of it as a buffer, then I guess that makes sense.
Yeah.
I mean, another thing you could do is to actually take a string as a parameter and then just say, look, the caller is responsible for, if you want a zero allocating string, pass me a string instance that does not allocate.
We can't use strings because the writer's calculating the length. It's the second byte is the last thing it knows.
Right, it needs to be able to back up. Yes. Okay. Okay. So it needs to be a seekable string, is what you're telling me.
Right. So we could do it if we wanted to do seekable string, but then it would need to, once you exceeded 1 byte for your length, it would need to go move everything, or it just held everything in buffers before writing it to the stream. So
okay.
Streams don't make sense with TLD.
Fair enough.
But yeah, so and then I suggest it as an overload because most people just won't care instead of default parameter or anything. Okay, so if it's not pooling, it's not disposable. So we drop the iDisposable in the dispose method. I think the reset method is still valuable. That's don't throw away the array, but just move back to a initial state. So if you called encode, it would write 0 bytes. So I've already called encode. Now I just want you to start over and be fresh.
Is the root set mutable?
Sorry, go ahead.
Is the root set mutable?
No.
Okay.
Most other APIs that write to a stream or an array we call clear instead of reset. Just throwing that out there.
All right, we can call it clear.
I'm just thinking if it's a stream-like API, I'm just thinking back to like all those names that we tend to use for that.
Yeah.
Okay. So I support both the easy-to-use encode and just be the byte array as big as you need to be, and then also a try encode, and then following the guidance that I wrote, there's a method that will tell you what the minimum size buffer you need to give to try encode is. So that's the get encoded length method.
And it's the actual number. It's not a GIF.
In this case, it's an actual number, or if you're in a state where you've started something like a sequence and you haven't finished it, it'll throw to tell you that it really can't answer the question. Also, because encode was going to throw, so there's no point in asking the question.
I see. So if you haven't written everything that makes sense, then yes, I think that's fair.
Right.
And we're thinking we don't need a try pattern because the caller really should never invoke this method if it's in a bad state.
For try get encoded length?
Yeah.
Yeah, because the only reason to call get encoded length, at least that I can think of, is you're about to call try encode, and if you're calling try encode, that means you believe it's already in a consistent state.
Okay, so that means the error is on the caller side. So, like you said, they were going to see an exception anyway. May as well prompt the exception now. Okay.
Yeah.
What is the exception you're throwing? Invalid operation exception?
Actually, apparently, get encoded length. I said -1 if it's not completed. We can make it an exception.
Yeah.
I think invalid operation would make sense because for the most part we don't have try methods for that in the framework because the assumption is that you know. It's a precondition that you can statically ensure it's true.
Yeah. So you were saying yes exception, Emo?
Yeah, I think -1 is bad because every time you give people a length that is bad things can happen.
It compounds the errors. Yeah.
What's going to happen is someone is going to stack alloc -1, and then their application will AV, and they'll wonder what happened.
Yeah, that's probably true.
Yeah. So it should just be the same invalid operation exception from try and code. In fact, I'll probably just cheat in the implementation now and try and code. We'll call get encoded length to understand if destination's big enough and cascade that same exception.
All right.
And then so there's a thing inside the ASN1 language called default. So you can say that a field has a default value, which will have an encoding that is correct for whatever that value should be. In dir mode, you're not allowed to write down the value if it's its default. That's actually a violation of the spec. So a thing that frequently comes up is temporary encoding a value to find out if it is the default value, and then asking if it's the same, rather than doing something like peak span or something that would leak back the current buffer state. The only time I was ever asking the writer for its span was so that I could compare if it was equal to a thing, so I added a value equals method. So that would be, thank you, Barry. That would be, this just says, if I encoded, will I encode exactly to these bytes?
Sure. And you're comparing the contents of the current writer, correct?
The value that it would produce for encode or try encode.
Okay.
So not the payload, but the full TLV.
So value equals to me seems like a strange method name. That's why I was thinking I would probably name that content equals or encoded value equals, because you're comparing the encoded value against other. That might be too verbose, I don't know.
Encoded value equals seems fine to me.
Yeah, I mean, you're not comparing the writer itself, but you're comparing what the writer will produce. I think encoded value equals makes more sense, actually.
All right.
Yeah, and I know that this is also something that you've tried to balance in the framework design guidelines as well. Like how do you weigh, having a short, succinct method name versus being descriptive enough where you don't just need to add comments everywhere? So, I mean, feel free to have an opinion yourself too. Obviously, you've lived and breathed this space for months on end.
Yeah, value equals was as I was moving this from just internal code into an experimental package from CoreFX Lab. I was like, man, I really don't want to expose this span, and so it was just written to solve the one problem I'd ever had of why I was calling peak span.
Okay.
So encoded value equals this one.
Okay. But no, I agree with your original predicament. You don't want to expose the span as is.
Okay, so we've got 15 minutes, so let's go ahead and talk about the controversial topic. The namespace.
Okay.
So you may have noticed, or not, that I have not yet mentioned the namespace for any of this.
I did notice that.
In violation of Emo's guidelines on how to write API specs. So the easiest answer, and the answer it currently has, is system security cryptography.asn1. But given that we're also this release working on a CBOR reader and writer, and we may in the future have other binary encoding type things, and as well as the fact that this is going to be used by LDAP, and I don't know how much extensibility people are going to put on LDAP on top of what Jose is providing for the platform. I recommend that we make a new second level node called something like binary encodings, and that we put this in something like system.binaryencodings.asn1, which will then also help shape the package, because we're going to end up needing Net Standard 2.0 package for this. We already have enough internal requests that it'll fly.
Oh.
Emo.
I
Hi, Emo.
yeah. I mean, I think I had a quick chat with Jeremy offline at some point about this. So I hear what you're saying, and strictly speaking, it probably makes sense. I just don't know that I would put it in that top-level namespace. It seems weird to come up with a new top-level namespace. I mean, not top-level, but like under system is basically top-level for us. Like that, because I mean, you have a bunch of shit that is also binary encodings that wouldn't be there, so it seems weird. It kind of promotes it more than we probably want.
The text encoders are underneath system.text.
Yeah, but they're also dealing with text.
Yeah.
I mean, we also have system.buffers, which is also kind of about binary encodings if you squint. Like yeah.
I mean, like system buffers ASN1 and system buffers CBOR isn't terrible. It's just not great. But I think with the CBOR, we would be hard pressed to shove it somewhere like cryptography, and once we figure out what we want with that, this would probably match. So I'm just bringing it up earlier.
So what is CBOR again?
Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, what was CBOR again?
CBOR is concise binary object representation. It's for Barry for a crypto thing, but it's not crypto.
I mean, but you realize why I think that to me kind of means that systems regarding cryptography.asn1 might not be perfect, but it's very close to perfect.
Right. So CBOR is trying to compete with all the data pack things and JSON, and so it's definitely trying to structure itself as being general purpose and not. The fact that we need it only for this one thing right now means that we shouldn't bury it there.
Yeah, CBOR does not belong in system.cryptography. It does not.
Well, would it be, so even if CBOR itself weren't under system cryptography, would it be bad if it pulled in types that were under system cryptography, or is that just a non-starter?
CBOR is currently trending toward just primitives, or strings and strings and byte arrays. So, Eric, if you want to jump in and say otherwise, that's fine.
Right. Well, so I guess I was thinking like that particular feature that's being worked on, the CBOR feature, does not actually expose any of these types, correct? Or does it just use them under the covers?
Oh, it doesn't use any of these at all. I'm just indicating we have another thing coming through that is a general purpose value encoder that doesn't fit under cryptography. So that since we're adding the two of them in the same release, it probably makes sense to think about their namespaces together.
I mean,
and so that's where I get system binary encodings ASN1 or system.binary.asn1 or system.buffers.asn1 or whatever. I can understand an argument for burying this one under cryptography, but CBOR really, really doesn't belong there, and it doesn't have any natural place that I could find in our existing namespace hierarchies.
And I'd argue this is not a cryptography class, and I wouldn't want cryptography littered with it, just because we're going to be using it for LDAP, which is not crypto.
Sure. It's just, I guess we're colored in the sense that our uses up till now have been cryptography, so it was just a convenient dumping ground for it.
Yeah, I'm less concerned about littering cryptography. I'm more concerned about littering whatever that thing is with cryptography. I think it's more the other way around, but yeah. Yeah, I guess we don't have a great namespace. I mean, I think we talked about data before, because data is really usually databases. That's not great. Honestly, like system buffers dot blah might not be bad. It's probably the closest we have.
Yeah, so the thing about system buffers is the system buffers namespace generally is reserved for everything related to like the array pool iBuffer writer, stuff like that. It's not necessarily something that provides encoding, decoding facilities on its own.
And we could do system.buffers.encoding.
Yeah.
Ooh.
I mean, but system buffers all up just seems like the wrong top-level namespace for it.
Jeremy just wants his own namespace.
I mean, we could call it system.jeremy if we really want to, and then
I think Ben Adams has precedence on that.
Yeah, if you want to put it on a system Ben, I'm fine with that. Like system ben.asn1 seems reasonable.
And we wouldn't want like system.io.encodings or something like that. The IO namespace might be weird as well.
No, IO is literally IO, right? Like, I mean, this is just, I mean, this basically assumes you got IO from somewhere already, right? Like,
Not necessarily, because like binary reader, binary writer are under system IO.
But aren't they reading and writing to a stream?
They are, yes.
Yeah. Yeah, the fact that that streams don't work well with the writer here means system IO really means system streams.
Got it. System net encodings. System net encodings.
That feels dirty.
It does system.protocols.
That's an interesting one.
Do we have that?
Nope, but we can always make it.
Oh, sure. I mean, the question now, I know that this is an internal politics problem, but it's if we put the word protocols in something, does that mean that we get a mountain of paperwork out of compliance?
I don't think so. I mean, it's not I mean, protocol, we have an obligation to document our own protocols, but like this is somebody else's protocol that's already documented, right? So that seems fair. I mean, honestly, protocols is probably the one I could live with the most because it seems like we get reuse out of that. What I don't like about binary encodings is that we already have binary encodings that aren't there. Like that's why I don't like it. I mean, protocol, you could make the same argument, but protocol seems also to be a bit more, let's say, hand-wavy about what we consider a protocol.
Yeah, I was going for something that's just generic.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. To me, more generic makes more sense, but also I would not pick something that already conflicts with everything we have, which is why I don't like binary encodings. And I think Jamie also proposed encodings, which I think is even worse because we already have an encoding class that's elsewhere, so it seems unfortunate.
Sorry, Corey, I think you started to say something.
Rather than making a namespace that's just protocols, because then we'll have a debate of, hey, what other things should we put in protocols in the future? Is there a certain class of what this thing is doing that would make a more appropriate namespace?
So we do already have a namespace for serialization all up, and this, in theory, could go under that namespace, but as Jeremy alluded to, it's not really a serializer in the typical .NET sense. It's just kind of a data smuggler.
So what namespace do you think that is? Because system runtime serialization is not a namespace that would be used for anything modern.
Well, system runtime serialization is like basically all of the object serializers in the framework, of which if we had a proper object serialization mechanism for this, that would be a viable namespace for it. But again, as Jeremy said at the beginning, like it's not doing all of serialization. It's just please read and write these values to a stream.
Yeah, that feels wrong.
Yeah.
I also would say system random serialization is largely tech we don't recommend anymore. I mean, it has the data context serialization in there as well, but for JSON in particular, we would use something else. We would not use that one, right?
Yeah, I thought it was okay for JSON, but I'm on an AsnReader, so whatever.
I mean, if you can figure out a way to make money with this, you can also put it on enterprise services. System.enterpriseservices.asn1 works for me as well.
Well, the spec is so huge, it is obviously an enterprise spec.
Works for me. Way to make Jeremy happy. So what do people think of protocols? Like, I would probably not put it directly in protocols. I would probably say system.protocols.asn1 and then you dump everything there.
Yeah,
I agree with that.
Because that also means we don't create a dumping ground.
Yeah, well, system protocols itself becomes a dumping ground top-level namespace. So
yeah, but on the other hand, though,
before we go down that road, we need to know what else we'd want to add in there.
See, but that's the thing, right? Like, I mean, looking through Jeremy's spec, I see 12 of different possible encodings, which I'm not sure that, where else will we put them? Let's say we find the perfect home for AsnWriter, and then now we have to support something else, then what? Like, actually having that dumping ground for third-party protocols seems not necessarily a bad idea. Because I think the problem is not everything will be as great as JSON that deserves a top-level namespace, right? Or
sure,
a promotion somewhere else, or XML, or whatever it is, right?
So if we had some kind of RPC reader-writer mechanism, would it go under system.protocols.rpcx or whatever?
Why not?
So it's basically a generic reader-writer that's opinionated in the sense that it follows a spec.
Yes.
I mean, the real question is, are we like this is a data protocol and not a network protocol, and I wonder if protocols like are we putting both in there? Like, would HTTP belong under protocols if we didn't already have it in the platform?
So I think this is why I can live with that, is that I would say, to me, system and protocols would be things that are not important enough to deserve their own, stage, if you will. Which I think that's why I can live with the fact that JSON isn't there, XML isn't there, and HTTP isn't there, because clearly they're the backbone of the platform, so they're baked into the thing. Versus the things under this would be just random other things that you may want to use, but they're not they're not mainline enough to be promoted elsewhere. I know it's hand waving, but that's
this might also just be something that we would need to bat about over email over the course of a few days.
Yeah, so I'm fine with system.protocols.asn1. I think we need a new node under system for at least this and CBOR, and then any other future things that are competing with the general notion of how you structure data on in a file or on the wire.
Yeah. So we could over email just aggregate a list of all the different things that we think might fit under this. That way we can see if system.foo or system.bar or whatever is an appropriate dumping ground for it all. But I mean, I don't think that affects the API surface here largely. I mean, a namespace search and replace isn't that difficult. And the API, as we've reviewed so far, seems appropriate regardless of which namespace it's in, right?
Right. We were moving into a new section, and it seemed like a good time to talk about the namespace.
Okay, sure. I know, Emo, you had a conflict, so.
Yeah, so I mean, this is the thing. Yeah. So I have to go now, but I think we made good progress. So I think the writer, we only cover part of it, right?
We covered the sort of high-level structure, and the next sections are for each data type, how we deal with them.
Yeah. So I think it's fair to say that, 1 hour clearly doesn't work for this. We probably need another full 2 hours in order to really review this.
Yeah, I mean, the reader or readers are going to be very similar to the writer, but we do have like 15 different concepts to get through of the data types and whatnot. So 2 hours is probably good.
Yeah. All right, I'll send notes. I'll consider this in progress, and then I think we should probably start the discussion about the namespace.
And which namespace do you like the least, Emo, just so I know which one to vote for?
System.jeremy, system.barry, system.ben. I mean, if we could support emojis, I mean, there's a whole range of things you could use now.
No, I was told I was not allowed to use emojis in my code because I generally chose one that was immature.
Oh, it was
Framework Design Guidelines 3rd edition has the controversial or semi-controversial use only ASCII characters in your identifiers.
I like that rule actually.
So yeah, my identifier is going to be a less than, a greater than, a K, an underscore, and something else. All ASCII.
Okay, on that note, I have to sign off. All right, thank you guys.
I got an employee. It's first, not third.
All right, bye-bye, guys. Wave
Right.
wave
Good,
to say
goodbye,
goodbye.
everybody. This is